There is a moment you won't see it coming, and you won't recognize it while it's happening, when your entire life quietly changes direction. Not with thunder, not with some cinematic flash of light. It happens in silence, in the pause between one breath and the next. In the second you almost said no, but said yes instead. In the morning you woke up and for reasons you couldn't explain decided that today would be different. I want to talk to you about that moment, because I believe you're standing in it right now. Let me start with something strange, something most of us never say out loud. We spend most of our lives waiting for permission. Permission to begin, permission to want more, permission to walk away from what no longer fits us. We wait for a sign, a certainty, a guarantee that if we take the leap, the ground below will hold. We tell ourselves we're being patient, wise, responsible. But if we're honest, if we're really honest, much of that waiting is fear wearing the costume of caution. And here is the quiet, uncomfortable truth I've come to understand. The permission you're waiting for was never going to come from outside of you. No one is going to tap you on the shoulder and say, "Now, this is your moment." There is no external authority whose approval finally unlocks your life. The green light was never out there. It was installed in you the day you were born, and every year since, you've been the only one with the power to turn it on. So let me say something that might sting a little, and might also set you free. The universe is not withholding your breakthrough. You are not being punished with delay. You are not ready. What you've been calling waiting was actually becoming. Every closed door, every rejection, every version of you that fell apart in private, that wasn't the universe saying no. That was the universe quietly assembling the person capable of carrying the yes. Think about a seed for a moment. Before it becomes anything visible, it spends its most critical time in complete darkness, underground, seemingly doing nothing. If you dug it up halfway through that process to check on its progress, you would kill it. The very darkness that looks like failure is the exact condition growth requires. Nothing about that process is wasted. Nothing about that process is punishment. It is design. Most of us have lived at least one season of our lives underground, grieving something, rebuilding something, quietly falling apart while still showing up to work, still smiling in photographs, still functioning because functioning was the only thing available to us. And in those seasons it's easy to believe we are behind, off schedule, late to our own lives. But there is no universal clock keeping score of who's ahead and who's falling behind. There is only the truth of where you actually are, and the truth of what that season is quietly building in you. Here's something I've noticed about people who go on to build extraordinary lives, and I mean truly extraordinary, not the curated highlight reel kind, but the kind built on real transformation. They all, without exception, went through a period where they had to let an old identity die. That's the part nobody warns you about. Growth is not simply addition. It is not simply gaining new skills, new opportunities, new titles. Real growth requires subtraction. It requires the death of a self you've outgrown, the self that needed everyone's approval, the self that shrank to keep the peace, the self that mistook comfort for safety. And death, even symbolic death, even the death of an old identity, feels like grief. It feels like loss. Which is why so many people standing at the edge of their own transformation mistake the discomfort for a warning sign. They think this must be wrong because it hurts. But some of the most important doorways in a human life are only reachable through discomfort. Not all pain is a red flag. Some pain is simply the sound of an old skin splitting so something larger can stand up inside it. I want you to consider your fear for a moment. Really consider it, without judging it. Fear is not the enemy of your becoming. Fear is actually a kind of compass, though a clumsy one, because it points with equal intensity toward danger and toward growth. The nervous system cannot always tell the difference between the fear of being harmed and the fear of being changed. Your heart pounds the same whether you're standing at the edge of a cliff or the edge of a life you've never dared to live. So the question was never, how do I get rid of fear? The question is, what is this fear actually pointing toward? Sometimes it's pointing you away from harm, and sometimes, more often than we admit, it's pointing you directly toward the exact thing your soul has been asking you to do for years. There's an old idea, found in nearly every culture, in every era, dressed in different language but carrying the same core truth, that a larger design is unfolding beneath the surface of our individual lives. Some call it fate, some call it providence, some call it simply pattern. The recognition that nothing arrives randomly, that every person you've met, every failure you've survived, every unexpected turn was somehow load-bearing in the architecture of who you are becoming. You don't have to believe in destiny to notice this pattern. You only have to look backward, honestly, at your own life, and ask, was there ever a closed door that later revealed itself as protection? Was there ever a heartbreak that years later you were secretly grateful for? Most people, if they're honest, say yes. And if that's true, if the story of your past makes more sense in hindsight than it ever did while you were living it, then perhaps the story of your present deserves the same trust. Perhaps what feels like confusion right now is simply a chapter you haven't finished reading yet. Let's talk about identity for a moment, Because I think this is where the real war is fought. Not out there in the world, but quietly, privately, in the architecture of how we see ourselves. Most people don't fail to change because change is too hard. They fail to change because somewhere along the way they built an identity around their limitations. I'm just not a risk taker. I've never been good with money. People like me don't get opportunities like that. These sentences feel like self-knowledge. They are not. They are old survival strategies that have outlived their usefulness, dressed up as personality. Here's the liberating part. Identity is not fixed. It is not some ancient stone tablet handed to you at birth. Identity is closer to a story you've been telling yourself for so long that you've forgotten it was ever a choice. Which means, and I want you to really sit with this, you have the standing, right now, today, to author a new chapter. Not by pretending, not by lying to yourself, but by simply asking a braver question than the one you've been asking. Instead of who have I always been, ask who is available to become. There's a kind of courage that doesn't look like courage at all. It doesn't roar. It doesn't announce itself. It looks like sending the email you've rewritten 9 times. It looks like saying the true thing in the room where it would be easier to stay silent. It looks like choosing, one more time, to believe that your effort is not wasted even when the results are invisible. That quiet, undramatic courage is the real engine of every transformation you've ever admired in someone else, not the highlight reel, the unseen repetitions before it. And maybe that's what this moment is really asking of you. Not a leap into the unknown with fireworks and applause, but a series of small, unglamorous, deeply honest choices, repeated with a kind of stubborn faith, showing up on the ordinary Tuesday when no one is watching, choosing the harder truth over the easier lie, trusting the process even when the process refuses to explain itself. Somewhere out there tonight, someone is standing at the exact threshold I'm describing. Maybe it's a decision they've delayed for years. Maybe it's a relationship they know, deep down they've already outgrown. Maybe it's a dream they buried so long ago they've almost convinced themselves it was never real. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. The delay was never a punishment. It was preparation. You were not being kept from your life. You were being kept for it. And here, finally, is the revelation I want to leave you with. The one thing I hope you carry out of this room tonight. The one thing I hope you remember on the hardest day of whatever comes next. The green light was never a signal you were waiting to receive. It was a decision you were always capable of making. The universe did not withhold your permission. You did. And the moment you stop asking the world to confirm that you're allowed to become who you already sense you are, that is the moment the plan that's been unfolding beneath the surface of your life finally rises up to meet you. You were never behind. You were never too late. You were being built, quietly, in the dark, for exactly this. So take the step. Not because it's guaranteed, not because the fear disappears, but because somewhere inside you, a light has been green for longer than you've been willing to admit. Go. Here it is, expanded to roughly 600 words, no headings, no closing summary. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard. It comes from waiting too long, waiting for someone to tell you it's safe, waiting for a sign clear enough that you couldn't possibly misread it, waiting for the version of certainty that never actually arrives in a human life, because certainty was never part of the deal. Most of us were taught, without anyone ever saying it directly, that permission comes from outside. A parent's approval, a teacher's praise, a boss's promotion, a partner's reassurance. Somewhere along the way we learned to scan the room before we trusted our own instincts. And that habit, so quiet and so early, becomes the architecture of an entire adult life. We keep waiting for someone to hand us the thing we were always allowed to take. Here's what makes this so difficult to see in ourselves. Waiting doesn't feel like fear. It feels like responsibility. It feels like patience, like wisdom, like I'm just being careful. We dress the delay up in respectable language. We call it timing. We call it not being ready yet. We call it waiting for the right conditions. But underneath most of that careful language is a much simpler sentence, one most people never say out loud. I am afraid of what happens if I decide for myself and it doesn't work. So we keep asking the world a question it was never going to answer. Is this allowed? Is this safe? Is this my moment? And the world stays silent. Not because the answer is no, but because the question was never the world's to answer in the first place. Think about the moments in your life that actually changed something. Not the moments where someone gave you permission. The moments where you gave it to yourself. The day you finally said the true thing instead of the comfortable one. The day you left even though nothing outside had changed. Only something inside you had. Those weren't moments of external validation. They were moments where you stopped consulting the committee in your head and simply moved. This is the part that's easy to miss. Authority over your own life was never on loan. It wasn't something you had to earn back through enough achievement, or enough approval, or enough evidence that you'd finally arrived. It was yours from the beginning, quietly waiting under all that borrowed hesitation. The tragedy isn't that permission was withheld from you. The tragedy is how much time can pass while someone waits for a key they were already holding. And this is not a call to recklessness. It's not about ignoring wisdom, or ignoring the people who love you, or pretending fear doesn't carry real information sometimes. It's simply this: there is a difference between gathering wisdom and outsourcing your will. Wisdom informs a decision, outsourcing replaces it. One keeps you the author of your life. The other quietly hands the pen to someone else, again and again, until you no longer remember what your own handwriting looks like. So somewhere in you right now, there is a decision you've been circling for a long time, dressed up as not yet. And the invitation isn't to be certain. It's to notice that the only signature this moment was ever waiting on was your own. There's a particular kind of season in a human life that looks from the outside like nothing is happening. No visible progress, no milestones to point to, no story yet worth telling, just days that repeat themselves, quietly, without applause. We tend to call these seasons wasted time. We rarely call them what they actually are, which is foundational time. Consider what happens underground before anything green ever breaks the surface. A seed doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform its growth for an audience. It spends its most critical period in total darkness, doing work that produces no visible evidence for weeks. If you were unfamiliar with how growth works, you'd assume nothing was happening at all. You might even dig it up, out of impatience, to check whether it was still alive. And in doing so, you'd kill the very thing you were trying to help along. The absence of visible progress is not the absence of progress. Sometimes it's the precondition for it. Human beings go through the same underground seasons, and we are far crueler to ourselves during them than we would ever be to a seed. We call it falling behind. We call it wasted years. We compare our timeline to everyone else's visible harvest, forgetting that we have no idea what their underground season looked like, or how long it lasted, or what it nearly cost them. Comparison only works when you can see the whole story, and you can never see the whole story. You only ever see the part that already bloomed. There is a particular grief that belongs to these hidden seasons, the grief of feeling capable of more while circumstances hold you somewhere quiet, grieving a job that isn't moving, grieving a body that's healing slower than you hoped, grieving a relationship, a dream, a version of yourself that hasn't been born yet. And in that grief, it's easy to conclude that the delay means something has gone wrong. But delay and failure are not the same word, even though they can feel identical from the inside. What almost nobody tells you is that the qualities that later make a person's success meaningful, their patience, their depth, their capacity to hold complexity without panicking, are almost never built during the visible seasons. They're built during the underground ones. The season where you had to keep showing up without evidence that it mattered. The season where you had to develop a relationship with your own effort that didn't depend on immediate proof. That's not incidental to the story. That's the actual architecture the rest of the story stands on. If you look honestly at your own life, you can probably find at least one stretch of time you once considered wasted, that you now recognize, looking backward, as the exact period that built the person capable of what came next. The pain of it wasn't proof that it was pointless. It was proof that something real was under construction, in a part of you too deep to see from the surface. So if you're in a season like that right now, quiet, unglamorous, without visible reward, the discomfort you feel isn't necessarily a sign that something has gone wrong. It might simply be the sensation of being built. There's a part of every transformation that nobody puts on the highlight reel because it doesn't look like progress. It looks like loss. It looks like grief. It looks from the inside uncomfortably close to falling apart. We tend to imagine growth as addition, new skills, new opportunities, a better version layered neatly on top of the old one, like renovating a house while keeping all the original architecture intact. But real transformation rarely works that way. Real transformation asks you to let something die first, not metaphorically dramatic theatrical death, the quieter, more disorienting kind, the death of a role you played for years, the death of a self-image you built your whole identity around, the death of the person who needed everyone's approval before making a move, or who mistook constant self-sacrifice for love, or who confused staying small with staying safe. This is the part that catches people off guard. They expect growth to feel like expansion, like opening up, like relief, and sometimes it does. But just as often it feels like grief, the specific, disorienting grief of losing a version of yourself you spent years constructing, even if that version was quietly making you miserable. You can mourn a self you're glad to be rid of. Both things can be true at once. That contradiction is not confusion. It's just what transformation actually feels like from inside it, rather than how it looks afterward from a stage. This is why so many people, standing right at the edge of real change, mistake the discomfort for a warning sign. The logic feels airtight in the moment. If this were right, it wouldn't hurt this much. But that logic quietly assumes all pain means danger, when some pain is closer to the ache of a bone resetting after being broken. Not damage, but repair. And repair is rarely gentle. Not every hard feeling is a red flag. Some of them are simply what it costs to become someone your old self wouldn't recognize. There's an old image worth sitting with here, the idea of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. which we've flattened over time into a cute metaphor for self-improvement. But biologically, the actual process is far stranger and more violent than that. Inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar's body doesn't gently rearrange itself. Much of it dissolves into something close to formless liquid before it reorganizes into a completely different structure. For a period, it is neither one thing nor the other. It is not caterpillar, and not yet butterfly. It is simply undone, trusting a process it cannot see the end of, with no guarantee written anywhere in its biology that reassembly is coming. Most of us, at some point, live through our own version of that undone middle, the season where the old identity has clearly stopped fitting but the new one hasn't solidified yet, where you no longer recognize the person you used to be, but you also can't yet point to who you're becoming. It's a strange, formless, often lonely place to stand. And it's tempting, in that place, to scramble backward toward the old identity, simply because it was familiar, even if it was small, even if it was quietly costing you everything. But the discomfort of that undone middle was never proof that something had gone wrong. It was proof that the old shape had finally been outgrown, and something less familiar, and often far more spacious, was already underway. Fear has a strange reputation. We talk about it as though it only ever means one thing: danger, retreat, stop. But if you actually pay attention to your own body the next time fear shows up, you'll notice something curious. Your heart pounds the same way whether you're standing at the edge of a cliff or standing at the edge of a life you've never dared to live. The sensations are nearly identical. Tight chest, shallow breath, that electric hum of alertness running through your limbs. Fear, on its own, doesn't tell you what it's responding to. It only tells you that something significant is happening. This is worth sitting with, because most of us were taught to treat fear as a single reliable signal. A red light meaning stop, retreat. This is wrong, but fear is not actually that precise. It's an old, blunt instrument, inherited from a much more dangerous world. One where the line between this will kill me and this will change me didn't need to be very fine, because most unfamiliar things really were physically dangerous. That wiring hasn't updated much since then. Which means in the modern shape of a human life, fear fires just as intensely for a first date as it does for a genuine threat. It fires the same way before a job you've always wanted as it does before a car swerving into your lane. The nervous system doesn't distinguish. Only you can. So the more useful question was never, how do I make this fear go away? That question usually leads nowhere, because fear rarely disappears on command. You don't think your way out of a racing heart. The more useful question is quieter and harder. What is this fear actually pointing toward? Sometimes, honestly, it's pointing you away from real harm, and that instinct deserves respect, not override. But often, far more often than we're comfortable admitting, it's pointing directly at the exact thing some part of you has wanted for a long time. The conversation you've avoided, the application you've never submitted, the truth you've been rehearsing in private but never said out loud. There's a particular kind of fear that only shows up around growth, and it has a distinct signature if you know to look for it. It doesn't just make you want to retreat, it makes you want to shrink the whole idea down until it's small enough to feel manageable again. It whispers reasonable-sounding reasons to wait. It reaches for old evidence, old failures, old stories about who you are, and uses them to argue that this new thing probably isn't for you. That particular flavor of fear isn't protecting you from danger. It's protecting an old identity from becoming outdated. And those are not the same job, even though they can feel identical in the moment. Learning to read fear this way doesn't mean the fear stops arriving. It keeps arriving every time something in you is about to expand, but you stop treating its presence as a verdict. You start treating it as a signal worth investigating, rather than obeying automatically. You ask it what it's actually protecting, your safety or your smallness. And more often than people expect, once you ask that question honestly, the fear doesn't disappear, but it does stop being the one holding the steering wheel. It becomes finally just information. Loud, uncomfortable, occasionally useful information, walking beside you, instead of standing in the doorway blocking your way through. Most people believe identity is something discovered, the way you might discover a fact about the natural world, fixed, waiting to be found, true regardless of who's looking. We say things like, I've just never been a risk taker, or I'm not the kind of person things like that happen to, and it feels like we're reporting information, the way you'd report your height or your birthplace. But identity doesn't actually work that way. It isn't a fact you uncover. It's closer to a story you've been telling for so long that you've forgotten it was ever something you chose, or something that was chosen for you, long before you had the ability to question it. Think about where most of these self-descriptions actually came from. Somewhere back in childhood or adolescence or an early hard year of adulthood, a sentence got formed. Maybe it came from a moment of failure that stung enough to generalize. Maybe it came from a parent's offhand comment, or a teacher's dismissal, or a heartbreak that taught you it was safer to want less. In that moment, the sentence made sense. It was even useful, a kind of protection, a way to make an unpredictable world feel explainable. I'm not good at this, hurts less than I tried and it didn't work. People like me don't get opportunities like that, feel safer than the vulnerability of hoping and being disappointed again. The trouble is that sentence, formed for protection at a specific moment, rarely gets revisited. It just quietly calcifies into personality. Years pass, circumstances change, you change, but the sentence stays exactly where it was installed, still running in the background, still shaping decisions long after the situation that created it has disappeared. You don't experience it as an old survival strategy anymore. You experience it as simply who you are. This is worth questioning, gently but seriously. How much of what you call your personality is actually just an old adaptation that never got updated? How much of "I'm just not that kind of person" is really "I was hurt once in a way that made that kind of person feel dangerous to become"? These aren't the same thing, even though they can sound identical when you say them out loud. Here is the part that tends to surprise people once they really sit with it. If identity were truly fixed, truly a fact of nature, it wouldn't be so responsive to circumstance. But people change dramatically after certain experiences. A loss, a diagnosis, a move to an unfamiliar country, a friendship that shows them a version of themselves they didn't know existed. If identity were bedrock, it wouldn't shift like that. The fact that it does shift is the clue. It reveals that what you've been calling who I am was, all along, closer to who I've decided to keep being, often without realizing a decision was ever being made. Which means the question worth asking isn't "who have I always been?" That question just interrogates the past, and the past can't argue back. It will always confirm whatever sentence you've already accepted about yourself, because that's what memory does when you go looking for evidence. The braver question, the one that actually opens a door instead of describing a wall, is who is available to become, starting from exactly where I am. Not a fantasy, not a pretend version of yourself. Just an honest look at which parts of the old story were ever true, and which parts were simply old protection, dressed up for so long as personality that you mistook it for permanent. There's a particular kind of waiting that feels different from all the others, because it doesn't feel like waiting at all. It feels like readiness, like you've done the work, gathered the evidence, prepared yourself as thoroughly as a person can prepare, and now you're simply standing at the door, watching for some final signal that says "now, go," and so you wait for that signal. Weeks pass, sometimes years, and the signal never quite arrives, not because you failed to notice it, but because it was never a signal that was going to arrive from outside you in the first place. This is the quiet trick most of us fall for without ever realizing it. We imagine permission as something external, a green light that switches on somewhere out in the world, visible to everyone, undeniable once it appears. We picture it almost like weather, something that happens to us, something we simply have to wait long enough to receive, and so we keep scanning the horizon for it. We wait for the economy to feel more certain. We wait for our confidence to arrive fully formed before we act, instead of arriving through acting. We wait for someone whose judgment we trust to finally say, "Yes, now, this is your moment," as if their words could do something our own decision cannot. But that green light was never installed anywhere outside of you. It never lived in someone else's approval, or in perfect timing, or in the elimination of every risk. It lived exactly where it has always lived, in the part of you capable of deciding, right now, with incomplete information and no guarantee, that you are done waiting for conditions that were never going to arrive on their own. The signal you were scanning the horizon for was never going to blink on out there. It was always a decision available to you in here, and it still is, in this exact moment, regardless of what the moment before it looked like. This is not a small distinction. It changes the entire shape of a life, depending on which version you believe. If the green light lives outside you, then your life is essentially at the mercy of forces you don't control, waiting to be selected, waiting to be validated, waiting for the world to finally decide you're allowed. But if the green light lives inside you, then something enormous shifts. You stop being a person waiting for their life to begin, and you become the author standing at the exact place the next sentence gets written, holding a pen you were never actually without. None of this erases uncertainty. Deciding does not remove risk, and nothing about claiming your own permission guarantees the outcome you're hoping for. That was never the offer. The offer was smaller, and in its own way more honest. Not certainty, but agency. Not a guarantee that it works out, but the recognition that the waiting was never actually protecting you from anything. It was only delaying you from finding out. And so the search ends not with a discovery out in the world, but with a quiet turning inward, toward the realization that the permission you spent so long looking for was never lost, never withheld, never something you had to earn back through more proof or more time. It was simply set down somewhere along the way, in a season when waiting felt safer than choosing, and it has been sitting there ever since, patiently, exactly where you left it, still yours, still available, still capable of being picked back up the moment you decide to reach for it.